In the summer of 1812, the most powerful army in Europe had ever seen stood on the edge of the Russian Empire. This was Napoleon Bonaparte Grande Armee, a multinational force drawn from 20 nations. The initial invasion force that crossed the Niemen River on June 24th was a staggering 450,000 men, a living testament to the military genius of the leader. Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of Europe. A man had redrawn the map of the continent through sheer force of will, and his goal deceptively simple: force Tsar Alexander I to submit, crush the Russian army in one decisive battle, and be back in Paris by winter. Napoleon expected to win. His army expected him to win. The whole world expected him to win. But the Russian army did something strange. It refuses to fight. It ran, and that retreat would become the single greatest military disaster of the 19th century. This is the story of how Russia defeated the greatest military mind in history, not by winning battles, but by losing them on purpose. It's the story of how a deliberate, radical strategy turned Napoleon's greatest strength into his most catastrophic weakness. The unstoppable force. To understand the disaster, you first have to understand the man and his method. Napoleon's art of war was all about three things: speed, decisive action, and overwhelming force. His campaigns were lightning fast. He'd march his enemies at a blistering pace, forcing them to live off the land they were invading, and seek out the enemy main force to annihilate them in one glorious battle. This was the formula that had conquered Italy, Austria, and Prussia. And as the Grande Armee crossed into Russia on June 24th, 1812, he had one reason to believe this time would be any different. And as the Grande Armee crossed into Russia on June 24th, 1812, he had no reason to believe that this time would be any different. The political goal was to force Russia back into the continental system, an economic blockade against Great Britain. By smashing the Russian army, Napoleon would force the Tsar to cut all trade and accept French dominance. The initial advance was classic Napoleon. His massive army pushed forward, designed to trap and destroy the separate Russian forces under General Barclay de Tolly and Boiter Bagration. He pushed his men hard through long marches in the sweltering summer heat, and expecting to corner his prey near the border. But a strange thing happened. Every time Napoleon thought he had the Russian trapped, they just slipped away. The glorious battle he desperately needed never came. Week after week, the French plundered deeper into the vast, unforgiving Russian interior. But the cities they captured were eerily empty. The storehouses bare. The army, used to feeding itself by foraging, found only burnt field and torched villages. This wasn't a panicked retreat. This was a strategy. The Russian commander, Barclay de Tolly, made a decision that was controversial, as it is brilliant. He would trade space for time. He knew he couldn't beat Napoleon in a straight-up fight, so he just wouldn't. He would deny Napoleon his battle, stretch his supply line to their breaking point, and let the sheer scale of Russia do the fighting for him. So this was the Great Russian Gambit. Attrition. As the Russians fell back, they embraced a scorched earth policy, a ruthless tactic destroying everything they could be used by the enemy. They burned crops, poisoned wells, and evacuated entire towns, leaving nothing for the invaders. For the Grande Armee, this was a catastrophe. Napoleon's doctrine of living off the land was one of his greatest strengths. But in a landscape that has been deliberately turned into a desert, this strength became a fatal weakness. The logistical strain was immense. Napoleon had actually brought a huge supply train, but the primitive Russian road turned into mud in the summer storm. The wagons just couldn't keep up. Horses, vital for the cavalry and transport, died by the tens of thousands from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Soldiers marching on the meager rations began to suffer from dysentery, typhoid, and malnutrition. The Grande Armee was hemorrhaging men before a single major battle had even been fought. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, his effective force has been drastically reduced by disease, desertion, and starvation. Under immense political pressure to make a stand, the Russians replaced Barclay with the veteran General Mikhail Kutuzov. While he secretly agreed with Barclay's strategy, Kutuzov knew the army and the nation demand a battle to save Moscow. On September the 7th, 1812, near the village of Borodino, the two armies finally met. What followed was the single bloodiest day of Napoleonic Wars. It was a brutal head-on slugfest that lasted all day. By nightfall, the French had taken the Russian positions, but at a terrible cost. Napoleon had his tactical victory, but it was a hollow one. He'd failed to destroy the Russian army, which simply retreated in good order, and his own forces were severely weakened. A week later, Napoleon marched into Moscow, expecting to find the city ready to surrender and the Tsar ready to negotiate. Instead, he found a nearly empty metropolis. Its governor had orchestrated a mass evacuation, and soon after the French army arrived, fires began to break out across the city. For days, Moscow burned. Napoleon, the conqueror of capital, was now a master of smoldering ruin. He sent peace offers to the Tsar, but no response. Silence. For 5 long weeks, Napoleon waited in the ashes of Moscow, a prisoner of his own victory. As autumn began its slow, cold turn to winter, problems began. The Russian strategy had bled Napoleon's army white. Now it's time for phase 2, using the environment itself as a weapon. On October 19, 1812, realizing no peace was coming, Napoleon gave the order to abandon Moscow and begin the long retreat. His army was already a shadow of its former self, down to around 100,000 men. He tried to retreat via southerly route through unspoiled country, but Kutuzov revitalized his army, blocked the way, forcing the French back into the same ravaged path they had taken on their advance. You've probably heard of the myth that General Winter defeated Napoleon, but the truth is more complicated. The army was already broken by the time the first heavy snow fell in early November. The winter wasn't the cause of the disaster. It was just the final merciless nail in the coffin. Lacking a proper winter clothing, soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Without proper shoes, their feet became frostbitten. The remaining horses, their shoes weren't equipped for the ice, slipped and broke their legs. They were quickly butchered for food. And this is where the true horror began. Discipline completely evaporated. The retreat evolved into a desperate flight for survival. The Grande Armee dissolved from a fighting force into a long, staggering column of desperate men, haunted by swarms of Cossack cavalry and peasant partisans who appeared from the forest to attack isolated groups. Kutuzov's main army shadowed the French, picking off stragglers, mostly content to let hunger and the cold do his work for him. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became the campaign's horrific climax. Attacked on both sides by Russian armies, and with partially built bridge on their only escape route, thousands of soldiers and camp followers were cut down, drowned in the icy water, or simply trampled to death in the panic. It was the final ghastly symbol of a campaign that had collapsed into utter chaos. On December 14, 1812, the last frozen remnant of the Grande Armee staggered back across the Niemen River. Remember that force, around 450,000 men, had only crossed just 6 months earlier? Fewer than 100,000 made it out. The losses were apocalyptic. Over 200,000 horses and more than 1,000 artillery pieces were gone. Napoleon had suffered a defeat from which he would never truly recover. In the end, it wasn't a single general or one climatic battle that defeated Napoleon. It was a strategy of total national resistance. The Russians simply refused to fight his kind of war. They traded their own land and cities to bleed his army dry, turning his own core principle of speed and living off the land completely against him. They used the vastness of their country as a weapon. They scorched the earth as a shield, and the brutal winter was the hammer. The 1812 campaign shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and sparked the war that would lead to his final downfall. It was a brutal, costly victory for Russia, but it proved that even the greatest army genius in history could not be outsmarted by a strategy that was as patient, as vast, and as unforgiving as the land itself.